Last today's word is fancy. It's a verb. It means to talk, to have, or do something. Do you fancy a drink this evening? I did not fancy swimming in that water. To be sexually attracted to someone, he could tell she fancied him. To think you are very attractive and important. That Dave really fancies himself, doesn't he? More examples. Do you fancy someone on a day trip to Bath next Saturday? Do you fancy going out for a meal after work? What shall we do food wise? Do you fancy going out to eat? I thought he fancied me, but I had completely misread the signals. She knew he fancied her, but preferred to keep their relationship platonic. To imagine or think that something is so, he fancies himself as a bit of a singer. What do you fancy to win the cup this year? I fancied that I saw something moving in the corner. This isn't the first time has happened, I fancy. An expression of surprise. Fancy seeing you here. They have 8 children. Fancy that. How surprising. As an adjective, decorative or complicated. I wanted a simple black dress, nothing fancy. The decorations were a little too fancy for my tastes. Fancy cakes, expensive. We stayed in a fancy hotel near the Champs Elysees, a fancy restaurant. Passing fancy, something that you like very much for a short period. But for me, parachuting was no fancy, passing fancy. Take a fancy to start liking something or someone very much. Laura's taken a fancy to Japanese food. If something takes tickles your fancy, you like it and want to have or do it. I looked in a lot of clothes shops, but nothing really tickled my fancy. She has enough money to buy anything that strikes her fancy. Decorative or complicated or of restaurants, stores or hotels expensive. I wanted a simple black dress, nothing fancy. Something that you like very much. What is your fancy? To imagine or think that something is so to like or wish for. There are two things he fancies: fast cars and thundering music. Examples of fancy: a fancy procedure and pretty pictures are not needed. Critics will add to know that brain activities differ between the two groups. Some of them, by the accidents of his rating, loomed out in his fancy disproportionately large by comparison with the rest. We must remember that most performance was were great. Okay, it's repeated distractions, royalty, nobility, fancy dress, beautiful woman, glorious jewelry. The most obvious characteristic of man piece appear up to 1995, 1695 is fancy stagging. Is a man in uniform, a policeman, or a guest at a fancy dress party. The constraint is that the binary tree should be contiguously marked, a fancy name for a non-contiguous marking. A fancy term, it means nothing more at this point than the pervasive concept of the human person. Imaginative fancy or indirect knowledge was really enough. The films were superficial and huge sums of money were spent on fancy mechanisms like animatronics. Muddling through this century, however, we find that the conversation ethic has often been eclipsed by a predilection for fancy conversation tools. The old women should not listen to such fancy stuff. We may fancy an exotic force that contrasts with the humdrum or unhappy present, but we forget it in modern tools. Rethinking a classical does not mean guessing it up with fancy folderol and extraneous strumming so that it no longer bears any resemblance to the origin of such analysis were dangerously susceptible of countenancing individual fancy undermining a national crush. Thanks.